Hey everyone, it's Joel from Geek Studios, and this is your mini charge episode for Tuesday, January 20th, 2026. And today's episode is a follow up from a story we brought you on our most recent Friday Charge episode about a possible agreement between China and Canada regarding EV tariffs. Well, it looks like now the two countries have come to that agreement. This deal is already sending shockwaves through global auto markets. It touches everything from EV prices and climate goals to agriculture, geopolitics, and even U.S. trade policy. So, what exactly did Canada and China agree to? Why now? Who wins and who loses? And how could this reshape the North American EV market? Let's dive in. Canada and China finalized a trade agreement that dramatically reshapes EV tariffs between the two countries. Here are the key points. Canada will cut its tariffs on Chinese-made electric vehicles from 100% down to only 6.1%, but only for a capped number of imports. The quota starts at 49,000 EVs per year and is scheduled to rise to 70,000 vehicles annually within 5 years. In exchange, China will roll back steep tariffs on major Canadian exports, especially canola seed, along with lobster, crab, peas, and pork. Those Chinese tariffs have been crushing Canadian farmers and seafood exporters for years. So in effect, this is being called the EV for canola trade deal. From Canada's perspective, it reopens a critical export market. From China's perspective, it opens a back door back into the G7 EV market. To understand why this deal matters so much, let's rewind back to 2024. That's when Canada joined the US and European Union in slapping 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. The justification was straightforward. Chinese EV makers benefit from massive state subsidies. Their production scale is enormous, and their labor and environmental standards are looser. Canadian officials said domestic automakers simply couldn't compete with $20,000 EVs backed by the Chinese state. China then fired back. Beijing imposed heavy tariffs on Canadian canola and food exports, a devastating blow to their prairie farmers. That retaliation escalated into a quiet but serious trade war. By late 2025, pressure was building inside Canada to resolve it. Farm groups were furious. Food exporters were losing billions, and EV affordability in Canada remained a problem. So Ottawa came back to the table. Prime Minister Mark Carney framed the deal as more than a tariff swap. He called it part of a broader strategic realignment. There are 4 big goals behind this move. First, saving agriculture. China is one of the world's biggest buyers of canola. Reopening that market is worth billions. Second, trade diversification. Roughly 75% of Canadian exports go to the US. Canada has wanted to phase out that dependency for decades. Third, EV affordability. Chinese EVs are cheaper, period. Everyone knows that. We've talked about it on our podcast. Some are expected to arrive in Canada under $35,000. That matters in a country where EV prices remain painfully high. And finally, attracting investment. Canada hopes this deal will convince Chinese automakers to build factories, battery plants, or joint ventures inside Canada. Carney called it a new strategic partnership. That language alone tells you how big of a pivot this is. For those who support this agreement, say, consumers finally get affordable EVs, farmers get their Chinese market back, and Canada gets leverage outside the US. Some analysts even say this could speed up EV adoption enough to help Canada meet climate targets. But the critics say this undermines Canadian auto jobs. It risks dependency on China, and it could sabotage Canada's relationship with Washington. Ontario's premier warned it could hollow out domestic manufacturing. Labor unions say this opens the floodgates. And that brings us to the biggest geopolitical shockwave of all: what this means for the US and US EV market. This is where things get really interesting, because this deal doesn't just affect Canada, it directly impacts the United States EV market. First, Washington is furious. US officials were blunt. The US Trade Representative called Canada's movement problematic. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy said Canada would regret the decision. Why? Because the US currently blocks Chinese EVs with tariffs up to 100%. Washington is trying to keep Chinese automakers completely out of the US market. Canada just cracked the door open in North America. From Washington's point of view, that creates a massive loophole. Also, China might use Canada as a backdoor into North America. Analysts say Chinese EV brands could now use Canada as a launchpad. First, build brand recognition in Canada. Second, set up distribution networks. And third, build factories or assembly plants in Canada or Mexico. That's the same strategy Japanese and Korean automakers used decades ago. If Chinese firms start building vehicles inside North America, U.S. tariffs lose their bite. And that terrifies Detroit. Also, this agreement applies competitive pressure on U.S. automakers. Chinese EVs dominate the sub-$25,000 segment, and that's exactly where U.S. automakers are weakest. Ford, GM, and Tesla still struggle to profitably build affordable EVs. If Canadians start driving $22,000 BYDs and $25,000 Geelys, that pricing pressure doesn't stop at the border. It reshapes consumer expectations across the continent. And finally, you have supply chain implications. Even if Chinese EVs don't enter the US directly, their components might. We're talking battery cells, electric motors, power electronics. North American auto supply chains are deeply integrated. Canada opening the door means Chinese content will inevitably flow south. That complicates U.S. trade enforcement. So what is the market impact and who exactly benefits? In the short term, it's Canadian consumers, Canadian farmers, and Chinese automakers. Tesla and Volvo may also benefit since both source vehicles from China for global markets. In the long-term wildcards, BYD, Geely, SAIC, and other Chinese EV manufacturers. These brands could use Canada as their North American beachhead. The import quota is modest, under 3% of Canada's total auto market. But symbolically, it's massive. Also, this deal is happening during rising U.S.-China trade tensions, as well as rising U.S.-Canada trade tensions, a global battery supply chain realignment, and exploding EV competition. Canada is signaling it won't blindly follow Washington anymore. That's a big shift. Some see this as Canada stepping into a middle power balancing role. Others see it as dangerously naive. Either way, it's historic. So here's what matters going forward. Will China actually follow through on canola tariff cuts? Will Chinese automakers build plants in Canada? Will the U.S. retaliate? Will EV prices in Canada actually fall? And will Washington tighten USMCA rules? This deal is only the first domino. The Canada-China EV tariff agreement isn't just about cars. It's about food, jobs, climate policy, geopolitics, and the future of North American manufacturing. It could reshape the EV market for the next decade, and it might force Washington to rethink everything. All right, that's your mini charge episode for today. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to like and subscribe on YouTube. And if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, tap that follow button and leave us a quick rating and comment. It really helps the show grow. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay charged and stay geeky.